The most controversial part of the G20 Delhi declaration was probably the issue of Ukraine, but India managed to pull it off, and as a result, the declaration notably refrained from condemning Russia, acknowledging instead the differences among member nations regarding Ukraine conflict. Justine Nazario reports.
The G20 summit held in New Delhi concluded with a final declaration recognizing the lack of consensus among the world's major economies regarding the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, who hosted the summit, shared the news of the agreement on the final declaration with other world leaders. The disagreement over the Ukrainian issue had been a significant stumbling block in the summit's proceedings. Western nations had pushed for a strong condemnation of Russia's military actions in Ukraine, but this stance faced resistance from other G20 member states. In fact, the paragraph specifically addressing the geopolitical situation remained empty in the draft of declaration until the last moment. Despite the absence of Russian President Vladimir Putin and Chinese President Xi Jinping at the summit, the Western nations failed to sway the positions of the global South countries regarding Ukraine crisis. A portion of the article also reaffirms that the G20 is not the platform to resolve geopolitical and security issues, although the bloc acknowledges that these issues can have significant consequences for the global economy. The final declaration acknowledged the human suffering and negative impacts of conflict on global food and energy security, supply chains, macro-financial stability, inflation, and economic growth. It emphasized that developing countries, which had already been grappling with the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic, were the most affected by the ongoing conflict. However, the declaration also pointed out that G20 member nations held different views and assessments of the situation concerning the Ukraine conflict. Despite these differences, world leaders pledged to come together to address the crisis' impact on the global economy. They also expressed their openness to supporting initiatives that promote a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in Ukraine, aligning with the principles outlined in the United Nations Charter. Reporting, this is Justine Nazario, SMNI News.
The conclusion of the summit earned praise from G20 members, including China, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, and Russia. But Ukraine was unhappy with the result. Jane Cognita reports.
Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, who represented President Vladimir Putin at the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi, praised the host country, India, which he claimed has helped to consolidate the countries of the Global South. According to Lavrov, India has managed to coalesce G20 members from the Global South. He also said that the Global South stood up to protect their legitimate interests, which made it possible to prevent the West from once again Ukrainizing the entire agenda of the G20 summit and diverting attention from the problems currently being faced by emerging economies. The Russian foreign minister also said that the New Delhi declarations mentions in the Ukraine crisis are in accordance with the principles of the UN Charter. He also thanked India for preventing attempts to politicize the G20. While the United Kingdom and the United States talked up the joint statement as well, Ukraine expressed disappointment with the outcome, saying that the G20 had nothing to be proud of. To recall, Ukraine was invited in the 2022 G20 summit in Bali, Indonesia. However, it failed to receive an invitation from India. The G20 paved the way for talks between countries on the sidelines, and among them were talks between Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan and Egyptian President Fattah al-Sisi on Sunday. Both leaders successfully held face-to-face talks after a decade-long rift between their countries. Meanwhile, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman Al Saud praised India for its successful G20 stewardship. Saudi Arabia and India also unveiled a major trade and transport route linking Europe, the Middle East, and India as part of a broad alliance between said countries. Following the conclusion of this year's G20 summit, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in a closing ceremony, handed a gavel to Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, who is set to take over the presidency of the bloc in December. Reporting, this has been Jane Cognita, SMNI News.
Israel's spy intelligence service Mossad warned that Russia could sell advanced weapons to Iran, a move it claimed will endanger the Jewish state. Verhil Parba reports.
Mossad Director David Barnea expressed concern about Iran possessing advanced weapons by purchasing them from Russia. Barnea said such a move could endanger Israel's peace and maybe even its existence. According to the Mossad chief, Iran had intended to provide Russia with short and long-range missiles in addition to the unmanned aerial vehicles or UAVs it had sold to Russia for the war in Ukraine. Israel claimed it has successfully prevented the sale of the drones. Meanwhile, Israel's national security advisor warned that Israel will act against Iran's enrichment of uranium if it exceeds 60% because that means Tehran is pursuing the use of nuclear weapons. The Iranian regime previously said it had sold a limited number of drones to Russia even before the war in Ukraine and maintained that the sale had not violated any provisions provided by the United Nations. Tehran also warned Israel not to play with fire and threatened retaliation over Israel's alleged involvement in a drone attack at a critical defense facility in central Iran in January of this year. Reporting, this has been Verhil Parba.
Japan and South Korea's top leaders agreed to deepen their bilateral ties. King Song reports.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol both agreed to keep working together to deepen the bilateral relations between Seoul and Tokyo. The two leaders made the statement on the sidelines of the recently concluded G20 summit in New Delhi, India. Kishida also reportedly told Yoon that Japan has hopes for South Korea to chair the trilateral talks with China this year. Meanwhile, officials of Japan, South Korea, and China will hold talks in Seoul on September 25th. South Korea has served as chairman of the trilateral framework since it was formed in 2020. But now officials said they will look into the possibility of holding a three-way summit between South Korea, Japan, and China as the ties between Tokyo and Beijing have soured since the release of treated radioactive wastewater into the Pacific Ocean from the crippled Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Meanwhile, relations between Japan and South Korea have been improving. The Japanese government, the two countries' leaders, have so far held 6 bilateral talks in as many months. Solisobogo Kim Sang Imnida, SMNI News, South Korea.
A Chinese Navy hospital deployed for a humanitarian mission in the South Pacific ended its trip in the region. Jillian Libuit has the details.
East Timor became the last country in Southeast Asia visited by the Chinese Navy hospital ship Peace Ark. Dubbed Harmonious Mission 2023, Peace Ark left its home port from eastern China in early July with 126 medical personnel on board. The floating hospital toured 5 countries in the region, which include Tonga, Kiribati, Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, and Timor-Leste. The military-run vessel provided free medical services to thousands of Chinese and residents from the 5 countries in the South Pacific region. The ship has sailed to more than 40 countries since it was deployed in 2008. Meanwhile, the U.S. hospital ship Mercy is due to visit the Solomon Islands during the Pacific Games later this year. Navy hospitals from China and the United States visited the Solomon Islands in recent years amid growing competition for influence in the region. Reporting from New South Wales, this has been Gillian Libuit, SMNI News, Australia.